Hey ocean travelers around the world. This is the lost city of Atlantis. Ancient clues that refuse to die. For 2,400 years, scattered texts, sunken ruins, and stubborn geological puzzles have kept Atlantis alive. Tonight we test the clues that refuse to die. It begins not with a map, but with a conversation, passed like a sealed message from hand to hand. An Athenian lawgiver named Solon visits the temples of Egypt. There, learned priests share a story about a great island power beyond the familiar straits, a civilization with rings of water and land, canals broad enough for fleets, metals gleaming like sunset, and ambitions larger than its harbors. The tale travels home with Solon, is preserved among his circle, and is finally written down by a philosopher whose words echo through time, Plato, who shapes the narrative of a brilliant city that rises, grows proud, and falls in a single violent day and night. The description is not casual. Dimensions are given. Distances are noted. The setting is fixed beyond the pillars, a phrase most readers connect to the Strait of Gibraltar. The capital is drawn in circles. Land, water, concentric and engineered. Bridges and causeways connect the rings. Gardens and temples line the avenues. The port is busy. The people are confident. Then, in a span shorter than a storm season, the earth heaves, the sea runs high, and what stood above is swallowed. It is framed as a moral lesson about hubris and balance, yet it reads with the detail of an inspection report. That texture, measurements, materials, the choreography of canals, turns a parable into a puzzle. There is a reason. The opening still pulls listeners closer. It sounds like a location that could be checked. It names the sea. It sketches a city plan. It points to a route through the known world's gate. If a port truly vanished, evidence might still sleep in the seafloor. If a people truly sailed great distances, their trade would leave fingerprints, ingots, anchors, ceramics, harbor cuts in stone, pollen trapped beneath silt. The chain of custody is clear. Egyptian priests to Solon, Solon's notes to later Athenians, and finally Plato's dialogues. Each step invites questions. What was remembered? What was reshaped? What was metaphor? What, if anything, was memory of an older shoreline and the water that took it? Quick fact. A story can endure because it is beautiful. It can also endure because it fits the edges of older truths. Listeners through the centuries recognized familiar coastlines in the tale, islands ringed by harbors, cities married to the sea, cultures that rose with trade and fell with tremors. Those echoes keep interest alive. They are the reason researchers still lift sonar over continental shelves and still argue over canal lines in windswept marshes. This is a calm voyage across those echoes, step by step through the 10 stubborn clues that always return to the surface. The first stubborn clue is simple. Entire towns have been found beneath shallow water. Ancient piers stand in lagoon floors. Roads run a few strokes below the surface. Not every submerged wall is Atlantis, of course. Most are exactly what they look like. Old coasts, old neighborhoods, swallowed as seas rose. Yet every photograph of columns seen through clear water keeps the idea of a drowned city vivid in the public imagination. The second clue is the concentric plan. Around the world, a few places show circular shapes, some purely natural, shaped by geology, some built by hands for defense, ritual, or beauty. The match is rarely exact, but the pattern is catchy. The third clue is a rhythm in human history, abrupt collapses near coasts, where earthquakes and tsunamis can turn a thriving harbor into rubble and silence. The fourth clue is metallurgical, stories of orichalcum, a shining copper alloy, and caches of strange ingots found aboard ancient wrecks. The fifth clue is a sentence tucked in a text, beyond the pillars, as if to lay a compass on the table. The sixth is the ash of eruptions that darkened skies and sent waves outward. The seventh is the faint grid of cut stone along certain shelves when the light hits just right. The 8th is layers of mud that suggest upheaval in a single season. The 9th is the way traditions from many coasts remember a great rising of the sea. And the 10th is the endurance of the story itself. Legends that do not feed on anything tend to fade, but this one keeps finding new anchor points. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with ocean stories whenever you want. The tale moves outward, beyond Greece and Egypt, into a wider circle of flood memories. Across Mesopotamia, an old narrative describes a deluge and a vessel built in haste. Along Mediterranean shores, poets sing of islands shaken and capes broken. In the Black Sea region, some scholars imagine a rapid change from a lake to a sea, with salt water surging in and coastlines redrawn. Farther east, in the Indian Ocean, coastal communities tell of villages now beneath calm shallows. Across the wide Pacific, islands keep songs of storms and walls of water. These are not the same story, but they share themes: water rising faster than memory can hold, people moving uphill, survivors teaching descendants to watch the horizon. When known geological events are mapped, glacial melt pulses, volcanic calderas collapsing, tsunamis racing across basins, some oral histories line up in timing and place, others do not, reminding listeners that memory is both resilient and wandering. Still, the background is clear. Coasts are not fixed. Seas shift. What stood where land met water can be here one century and gone the next. To understand how much can change, picture the world at the end of the last ice age. Vast ice sheets retreat. Seas rise, not in days but across millennia, climbing step by step over ancient beaches, swallowing river mouths, and turning coastal plains into seabeds. Shelf topography explains a lot. Many of the best places to build, gentle slopes, sheltered inlets, access to fishing grounds and trade routes, sit on the continental shelf, which today lies just tens of meters below the surface. That is where old harbors often rest. Quick fact: if a map could drain the oceans by only a small measure, it would reveal a ghostly geography of former coastlines, some braided with channels and dotted with sandbars, where ports once had perfect cover from wind and wave. These drowned shelves are not mysterious. They are expected outcomes of rising seas. The mystery is whether any one of them fits the specifics in Plato's text. This calls for a calm, careful reading of what Plato actually wrote. 2 dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, contain the core description. The passages describe a layout with rings of land and water, canals broad enough for triremes, a temple to Poseidon, a plain described in measured terms, and a location beyond the Pillars of Heracles. There is a timeline, cast as events 9,000 years before Solon's visit, though the units and translation of years have been debated for centuries. The tone is moral, framing the fall as a lesson about moderation, yet the geographic detail is memorable. Allegory and memory can overlap. A wise story can be built on a real shoreline. To separate them, the reading pays attention to measurements, materials, and plausibility. Could a Bronze Age or earlier society have engineered broad canals? Could they have built causeways and harbors on a flat plain? Yes. Could an earthquake and tsunami erase the heart of a port in a day? Also yes. If the ground liquefied and seawalls fail, the open question is not whether such things can happen, but where and when they happened in a way that fits the text closely enough to merit the name. The first major hypothesis that many consider is centered on Santorini, ancient Thera, and the Minoan world. Here, a known eruption shaped history. An island caldera blew with force, ash spread across the region, and tsunamis raced outward. Harbors were struck, trade paused. The Minoan network changed course. The strength of this idea is obvious. It ties a vivid myth to a vivid event. The weaknesses are just as important. The geography is not exactly beyond the pillars, and the circular plan, while it resembles a caldera, lacks the engineered rings and canals described in the text. Still, many features feel right. Advanced seafaring, wealth drawn from trade, palatial centers that could be remembered as splendid capitals, and a dramatic disaster that people would retell for generations. It may not be Plato's island in the open Atlantic, but it can be an ancestor of the story, a nearer example of a maritime culture humbled by nature in the span of a single season. From the Aegean, attention turns south and west to the broad platforms around Sicily and Malta, where shallow seas cover stonework, and where ancient builders cut harbors into soft rock. Nautical plausibility matters here. Sailors moving along this corridor have worked these coasts since deep antiquity. Sheltered coves, sea caves, and carved channels line the islands. The shelf is rich in places to anchor, and the idea of a city with engineered waterworks in such a location is not far-fetched. But the match again runs into the same test. The text points to the Atlantic side of the Mediterranean Gate, and the detailed plan describes rings not merely formed by nature, but laid out by minds and hands. What lies under parts of these shelves is promising, but proof would require unambiguous walls, canals, inscriptions, and a city plan that matches more than mood. That leads to Iberia and the Atlantic gateways. West of Gibraltar, river mouths open to tidal plains, and marshlands shift with storms and centuries. The zone around Cadiz and the Doñana marshes has drawn attention because aerial images and ground surveys sometimes show ring-like features under sand and mud. Geomorphology explains many rings as natural old dune arcs, meanders, and lagoons, but the region's long history with Phoenician, Tartessian, and other cultures ensures a dense archaeological background. If a great port flourished and fell here, traces could be messy. Ports silt up, channels migrate, earthquakes shake the basin. The channel networks and shallow lagoons could look like rings to a storyteller, hearing second-hand descriptions of a complex estuary. To move from suggestive shapes to strong evidence, researchers look for alignments that form a city plan, not just curves. They hope for harbor cuts with tool marks, layers of occupation debris, and inscriptions tying names to places. Until finds of that clarity appear, the Cadiz-Doñana idea remains a patient candidate, often discussed, never quite confirmed. Beyond the mainland, the Azores and Canaries sit like stepping stones across swells. Volcanic origins explain their forms, with uplift and subsidence shaping coasts over long spans. A city in the mid-Atlantic would face different challenges: volcanic soils, fewer nearby trade partners in early periods, and swells that do not always favor simple harbors. Some argue for surprises, ancient sailors reaching farther than textbooks once admitted. Others point out that trade works best along coasts with many stops. The Azores hypothesis alluring because it fulfills the romance of a great island far out to sea, but it struggles with practical ancient logistics. If ever a true ancient harbor complex is mapped there, with quarries, ramps, and roads, the conversation would shift overnight. Until then, this remains a poetic possibility, not a proven one. A particularly photogenic idea has arisen from the Sahara's heart: the Richet structure, sometimes called the Eye of the Sahara. Seen from the air, it shows large concentric rings. The resonance with Plato's plan is eye-catching. Geology provides a calmer explanation. Wind and time have sculpted uplifted rock into circles, not humans. The ring diameters are vast, far beyond any practical city footprint. Erosion, not engineering, shape the view. The stones may tell a long story, but not one of ships passing causeways to reach a central harbor. This is a prime example of a trap the human mind falls into: pattern seeking in grand landscapes, connecting a familiar myth to a dramatic formation simply because the shapes rhyme. It is a good reminder: a strong hypothesis does not rest on beauty alone. Across the ocean, the Caribbean and the Americas offer their own temptations. Off Bimini, blocks of stone form straight lines that look like roads in popular images. Divers and geologists explain how natural processes produce such tessellations in certain rock types beneath wave action. Off Cuba, sonar scans have sparked rumors of geometric forms. Here again, caution matters. Sonar is a first glance, not a verdict. Currents, noise, and data processing can trick the eye. In the Pacific, Pohnpei's famed ruins at Nan Madol demonstrate the power of a water-laced city built on artificial islets and channels. A real-world example that helps listeners imagine how a place like Atlantis might have looked if it ever existed. Yet Nan Madol is firmly placed in known history and does not match other key criteria. The point is not that every underwater shape is a mirage, it is that each claim needs full fieldwork, mapping, dating, and cross-checking against regional archaeology. This is where underwater archaeology offers a reality check. 4 case studies. Settle the mind. Yonaguni, in Japan, shows plunging terraces and sharp angles that many once called a city. Later work favored natural fracturing and erosion. Dwarka, off India's west coast, combines mythic fame with real submerged structures that show human handiwork and occupation layers. Valuable, but not Atlantean. Doggerland in the North Sea is an entire drowned landscape that once connected islands to the continent. Cores and trawls recover peat, tools, and bones. In the Black Sea, anoxic depths preserve wooden wrecks in startling condition, proving that harbors and ships can be kept almost intact under specific conditions. These case studies teach quietly. They show what clear evidence looks like: tool marks in stone, artifact layers in place, wood preserved in silt, harbor walls that line up with city streets. They also show what wishful thinking looks like: rushing from a photo to a conclusion. The difference is patience. To understand how a port can disappear so fast that witnesses call it a single day and night. A short geology boot camp helps. Earthquakes can trigger liquefaction in water-saturated sediments, turning firm ground into fluid. Buildings tilt. Quay walls crumble. If a tsunami arrives minutes later, the combination is devastating. Volcanic islands can slump. Parts of a caldera rim can collapse into the sea. Coastlines can subside by 1 meter or 3 over a broad area after a quake, moving the shoreline inland without any wave at all. Methane seeps can destabilize slopes. While dramatic bubble stories often drift into fiction, real slope failures do occur, and bedforms record them. The traces of such events survive. Jumbled boulders washed inland, sand sheets across fields, rip-up clasts in cores, abrupt changes in the species of tiny shells that live in specific depths. A tranquil harbor can be reorganized by nature and reburied under calm silt in just a season or 2. Another question in the story asks how far ancient sailors could truly go. The picture is more generous than school maps once suggested. Bronze Age and Iron Age mariners used star paths, coastal silhouettes, and steady currents. They understood seasonal winds and read the chop on water the way farmers read clouds. They favored coastal hopping when possible, but open water stretches were not impossible. Hulls were sturdy, galleys could row when wind failed. Yet there is a difference between could and would. Trade routes flourish where there are many stops with something to exchange. The phrase "beyond the pillars" signals an Atlantic world, but whether the storytellers meant open ocean islands or the known shores of Iberia and Morocco remains part of the debate. What can be said with confidence is that ancient sailors knew Gibraltar's doorway and worked its tides. The metals in the story matter, because metals are fingerprints, orichalcum, often described as a shining copper alloy, fascinates readers. Archaeological finds of copper and copper alloys in shipwrecks show trade in ingots, raw and worked. Slag heaps near ancient smelters speak of production on scale. A city as described would leave behind material traces in harbors, spilled pellets, broken crucibles, scrap near quays, and a chemical signature in sediments. Alloy ratios tell tales, linking a find to a region's ore. If a cache of ingots marked with signs were found in a drowned warehouse beneath a ringed harbor, the path from story to evidence would shorten. Until then, the role of metals remains as a supporting detail, strong enough to build a clue around, not strong enough to be proof by itself. The reading of the original text continues, with a calm eye for transmission. Copies were made by hand. Unit stadia, plethora, were converted and reconverted. A scribe's error can magnify a distance or shrink a depth. The difference between an island and a peninsula can be a translation choice, and a number multiplied by 10 can turn a date from the Bronze Age into a span before cities rose anywhere. Numerology sometimes tempts interpreters to retrofit meanings to preferred outcomes. A clear approach resists that. It asks which reading fits the culture that told the tale, which units match other writings from the same author, and which combinations of numbers and places survive the test of archaeology. Put simply, a plausible scenario uses the simplest units and the fewest miracles. Modern technology now combs the shelves. Multi-beam sonar paints the seafloor in high resolution. Sub-bottom profilers send sound into sediment to read buried layers. Autonomous underwater vehicles trace grids no diver could swim in a day. Remotely operated vehicles hover over walls and follow cables into hollows. Satellite-based bathymetry gives broad brushstrokes of shape and depth over vast areas. This is the toolkit that finds real harbors, canals, and quarries. It is how researchers confirm straight lines at right angles joined by purposeful curves. It is how a ring seen from the air becomes a map with coordinates and cross-sections. Quick fact: the best surprises in underwater archaeology are not colossal statues. They are thin layers of soil that change abruptly, marking a moment when a human street turned to silt. With tools in hand, attention returns to where coastlines may hide cities, continental shelves worth scanning. Follow a simple logic. Near ancient river mouths, behind barrier islands, where lagoons once held fleets, along leeward shores tucked from prevailing winds, and at tectonic margins, where quakes and subsidence raise the odds of sudden change. Priority maps highlight the Atlantic side of Iberia and Morocco, the shelves around Sicily and Malta, parts of the Aegean and Ionian seas, the Black Sea's former shorelines, and selected pockets in the central and eastern Mediterranean. Each hotspot is judged by criteria: sedimentation rates, known ancient settlement densities, ease of anchorage, and how well ancient texts describe nearby landmarks. This is not a search for a myth alone. It is a search for drowned urban life in general, of which the Atlantis story may be a poetic representative. Among top candidates, Santorini and the broader Minoan network deserves a measured deep dive. Harbor reconstructions show busy maritime life. Ritual architecture suggests a cosmopolitan culture with ceremonial centers. Regional tsunami deposits prove that waves struck coasts that mattered. The strengths are tangible: advanced maritime skill, sudden destructive events, and archaeological richness. The mismatches fit inside a historian's caution. The specific ringed geography and the Atlantic placement do not align neatly. The fairest reading frames Santorini as a powerful analog, evidence that the core idea of a sea-linked civilization humbled by sudden natural forces is not only possible, but documented, even if the coordinates differ. A second deep look rests on the Doñana Cadiz littoral platform, where paleo estuaries once laced a broad coastal plain. Geomorphic rings show up in imagery, shaped by water and wind. The line between human engineering and natural forms is delicate, and it is here that careful trenching, coring, and dating matter most. Overlaps with Phoenician and earlier Tartessian presences enrich the context. If canals were cut here in antiquity, if quays were built and then drowned, the first confirmations would likely be modest: tool-scarred faces on channel walls, alignment between foundation stones, a scatter of ceramics sealed below storm layers. The vision of a ringed capital rises easily in the mind when looking at aerial photographs. The discipline is to ground that vision on shovel-tested lines. A third candidate focuses on the shelf around Sicily and Malta. There, human-made works and natural platforms meet in a patchwork: quarry traces, causeway-like features, and breakwaters, some confirmed, some debated, create a laboratory to study how ancient engineers partnered with the sea. Maritime historians note the strategic position between east and west, north and south. If a city with a signature canal plan had thrived here and then suffered quake, subsidence, and storm, clues might lie within a morning's boat ride from shore. Divers and surveyors have already catalogued much. The next steps, as always, are to stitch scattered findings into a coherent urban plan with dates that line up. For those drawn to wide water, the Azores sit as a fourth point of interest. The mid-Atlantic microplate and its volcanic features would challenge any large ancient settlement, but not necessarily preclude smaller, resourceful communities. Supporters imagine a maritime people extending a supply line across islands. Skeptics answer with the realities of ancient trade economics. Here, the bar for evidence is high. Harbors cut to shape, roadbeds, quarries with tool marks, and cultural layers that tie to known traditions on either side of the ocean. Until such evidence appears, the Azores remain an evocative horizon rather than a documented port. The fifth deep consideration returns to the Black Sea shelf and the ongoing debate about a rapid transgression from a lower freshwater state to a higher saline one. If shorelines raced inland within living memory, villages would have been lost in a human lifetime. Neolithic sites along former banks suggest real stories of relocation and adaptation. Though the Black Sea sits inside the Mediterranean world rather than beyond the pillars, its sedimentary record is a teacher for how sudden sea change looks in cores and how cultural layers respond. What would count as proof in any of these places? The answer is refreshingly straightforward. Replicable dates from multiple methods, stratigraphy that places human layers beneath abrupt marine deposits, inscriptions or place names that tie a site to a known culture, and a remembered city, a coherent plan of streets, walls, and waterworks that fits the described dimensions, ecofacts like seeds and fish bones that place daily life in context, and harbor works that could move ships in and out as described. A single photo or a lone wall will not do. Proof is a chorus, many lines of evidence singing the same song. Part of the process involves debunking popular claims without sourness. Some images that circulate are low-resolution scans that amplify noise into patterns. Some roads are beach rock fractures. Some pyramids are boulder stacks shaped by waves. A calm approach explains, shows comparisons, and then keeps working. Pattern seeking is a human strength. It just needs a companion named verification. Cherry picking is a constant risk. The remedy is to publish full data sets, not just the angles that flatter a hope. The most satisfying discoveries are the ones that resist the finder's bias and still hold up. Why does the story of Atlantis remain lively when so many other ancient tales sit quietly between covers? Psychology plays a part. People like the idea of a golden age, both to admire it and to measure it against the present. National pride sometimes folds itself around imagined ancestors. The romance of exploration draws attention across years. A bright map with the label unknown has a pull all its own. There is also a practical reason. Humanity now lives through rising seas again, though slower than a single day and night. Coastal communities watch the line on the beach creep landward. A myth about a city taken by water speaks to today with more weight than it did in times when shorelines seemed permanent. Culture and science have traded the story between them for centuries. Renaissance mapmakers played with shapes at the edge of their charts. Enlightenment thinkers argued about allegory and fact. Modern oceanography reclaimed the narrative stage, replacing sea serpents with sound waves, replacing speculation with surveys. The myth has steered explorers, and the explorers have in turn trimmed the myth, keeping the strong parts and discarding the weak. Together, they have built a healthier curiosity. Less about a single marvelous city, more about the many marvelous coasts humanity once walked that now wait a few fathoms below. To bring order to all of this, a fair synthesis ranks hypotheses with a simple scorecard. The criteria are transparent. Textual fit. Does the layout, location, and description align? Geological fit. Do known events and formations support the possibility? Navigational plausibility. Could ancient sailors reach, supply, and trade there? Archaeological signals. Are there existing finds pointing in the right direction? Technical feasibility. Can modern tools thoroughly survey the area? Weights can be adjusted, but the procedure helps keep feelings from steering the helm. In such a calm accounting, the Santorini Minoan complex scores high for event clarity and maritime culture, but lower for location mismatch. The Dunyana Cadiz Littoral scores moderate across the board with a strong need for decisive fieldwork. Sicily, Malta scores well for archaeology and navigation, with more to learn about exact urban plans. The Azores score low on practical ancient logistics, until strong finds appear. The Black Sea is an excellent analog for rapid sea change, but not a geographic match for the phrase about the pillars. The leaderboard is not a verdict, it is a living snapshot of evidence. The practical next steps read like a fieldwork wish list. In Iberia's tidal plains, targeted cores at ring-like anomalies could look for abrupt silt layers above occupation debris. Around Malta and Sicily, expanded multi-beam coverage of likely harbor cuts could refine maps and guide divers to promising straight lines and angles. In the Aegean, more work around tsunami deposits can better model the scale of past waves. In the Black Sea, continued shelf surveys will expand the catalog of drowned sites. On mid-Atlantic islands, a handful of carefully chosen bays could be mapped wall to wall for quarries and ramps. Each step is ordinary science, slow, precise, repeatable. Each step has the potential to shave uncertainty from a debate older than most nations. The script's calm current returns to the opening scene. The Egyptian priests, the Athenian visitor, the philosopher at his desk, and considers why the tale was told at all. It served as a mirror for Athens, a reminder that power must be tempered. It also preserved a hint that the storytellers had noticed something about coasts. They change. The sea gives and the sea takes away. Ports silt, walls sink. Quakes arrive without appointment. A people who live by the water live with memory as their compass. That may be the truest part of the story. In every generation, someone looks seaward and remembers a house that stood where fish now swim. A gentle image closes this part of the voyage. Early morning, over a modern estuary. The tide is out. Mudflats shine like bronze. In the distance, wooden posts rise in straight lines. The remains of a pier that once served small boats. Birds stand on posts that once tied ropes. Beyond, a navigation light blinks. It is not Atlantis. It is just a place where the boundary between land and sea has moved, as it always does. Yet even here, in the quiet, the mind holds the shape of a ringed city, and wonders which shelf, somewhere, holds stones that would answer old questions with simple facts. What makes the original description linger in the mind is the level of household detail. The city is not only grand, it is practical. The text speaks of bridges that cross channels, of quays that allow ships to tie off, of storerooms and temples placed with intention. The plan of concentric water and land suggests traffic moving in circles, as well as across spokes, a layout that can spread crowds and cargo without choking the center. The materials are named as if the writer could run a hand across them. Black stone, white stone, red stone. A temple glows with a facing of a shining metal remembered as orichalcum. Gardens and training grounds fill the spaces between walls and water, and a long straight canal connects the heart to the sea. The plain beyond is level, gridded, and irrigated, bound by mountains like a natural amphitheater open toward the coast. Taken together, the picture has the calm logic of a port built by people who understood work as well as ceremony. There is a lesson in this. Legends that endure often carry the weight of everyday tasks. A myth that speaks only of thunder fades. One that quietly mentions harbor depths and warehouse doors sits more firmly in the mind. When listeners today replay the account, they can imagine crews hauling cargo along a quay, farmers moving water through channels, and a lighthouse keeper watching the channel's mouth. Even the notion of a long, straight canal is not wild for the ancient world. Canals linked the Nile to harbors. Engineers in many cultures cut ditches, shaped banks, and understood how to keep water moving slowly enough for boats to pass without eroding the sides. If that knowledge is applied to a coastal plain with soft sediments, the result could resemble the described avenues of water. Beyond the layout, the rhythm of life in such a city is easy to picture. Ships arrive on the flood tide, unload amphorae and ingots, reload with grain, textiles, and crafted goods, then wait for the ebb. Market hours follow the sea. Festivals light the central island. Younger sailors learn star paths on the outer walls, where the view is clean and the wind is steady. The city's confidence comes not only from wealth, but from being a meeting place. Languages mix at the quays, and foods travel that once grew only in distant soils. When people retell the story, they remember not only the grandeur, but the feeling of a place tuned to the water's clock. The broader plain surrounding the city also matters. The description of measured fields is not ornamental. A city that supports a large population requires dependable food. A flat plain with rivers crossing it can be divided into rectangles, irrigated by gravity, and harvested in organized cycles. Ancient farmers in many regions used similar methods: raised banks, sluice gates, and seasonal maintenance that turned floodwater into an ally. If the plain sat at a low elevation near the sea, it would also face a quiet but constant challenge: subsidence and salt. Good management would keep the fields sweet and the drains clear. Poor management would invite the sea to creep inward, not as a dramatic wave, but as a slow salting of the earth. The story's memory of ordered fields hints at people who understood this balance and kept it, at least for a time. When the conversation returns to the cause of the city's fall, the calm approach holds. A quake is not a rare visitor in the regions named. The edges of plates whisper and sometimes speak loudly. If a large tremor shook a deltaic plain, the effect could be widespread liquefaction. The ground wobbles, water rises through sand, and structures lose their footing. If within hours, a tsunami arrived from a triggered landslide or a seafloor shift, the plain would briefly become an extension of the sea. There would be no need for dramatic fire or rifts. Simple mechanics could do the work. In the months after, the channels that once drained fields might become deeper tidal creeks, and silt would blanket foundation. A generation later, the memory would compress all of it into a day and a night, which is how human storytelling works when the turning point is obvious and the aftermath feels like a single season. In this light, the search narrows to where such a combination is both plausible and well placed for trade. Iberia's Atlantic plain fits many of those conditions. So do parts of North Africa's coast, with broad estuaries and barrier systems. The central Mediterranean offers similar geographies, though inside the pillars rather than beyond. The difference between these options is not whether a city could vanish, many could, but which one matches the details. Concentric works, straight canals, a gridded plain, and a sailor's doorway to the wider ocean. This is why the patient mapping of shelves and marshes remains the heart of the matter. A listener might ask a simple question here. If a city of such size and engineering existed, where are the inscriptions? Where are the carved stones bearing names and dedications that ancient builders loved to leave? The answer is practical. Stone is heavy and expensive to move long distances. In most coastal cities, only certain public works and temples bear grand inscriptions. Houses and shops, even in rich places, often used rubble and timber. If a flood covered a port district and silt sealed it, surviving inscriptions would likely be those anchored to durable cores, the base of a temple wall, the threshold of a gate, or a quay's face. These might still exist beneath mud, but until a trench finds the right line, they remain out of reach. The lack of inscriptions does not prove absence. It simply emphasizes how little of some shelves has been opened with trowel and brush. Another common question concerns the famous metal, orichalcum. The idea of a gleaming alloy tempts imaginations towards lost technologies, but there is no need to cross into fantasy. Copper alloys with golden tones are well known. Brass in different forms and copper with traces of other elements, can shine in ways that catch the eye. Shipwrecks have yielded copper and copper alloy ingots, whose composition can be tested with modern tools. The signature of an ore source, the blend of trace elements, is like a name tag. These signatures connect cargo to mines and mines to regions. If a city specialized in a particular alloy used in ritual or decoration, sediment near its docks could carry that chemical fingerprint in fine particles. A core driven a few meters into harbor mud can read like a diary, separating layers by century and linking pollution peaks to periods of heavy industry. This kind of quiet evidence is less romantic than a golden plaque, but it is often more decisive. Transmission of the story through hands and languages also has a tidy explanation. When numbers look too large or too precise, copyists may have used a unit that later readers misunderstood, or they may have slipped a zero in the wrong place. Ancient counting systems did not enjoy the safeguards of printers and typesetters. A skilled scribe is still a human being, and even careful hands can drift. This is not a defect in the story, only a reminder. Every ancient measurement is a prompt to check context. What constitutes a stadium can shift by place and period. If one reader assumes a longer unit and another a shorter one, their reconstructions diverge sharply. The solution is to hold several translations side by side and ask which set of units produces a plausible city and a walkable plain for people of the time. When that is done, many reconstructions grow more modest and more realistic. Seafaring in the relevant centuries provides the final layer of ordinary sense. Sailing out of the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar requires understanding its winds and currents. The flow at depth moves the Atlantic into the Mediterranean, while surface waters can move the other way depending on conditions. Ancient mariners learned to work the tides near the strait and to wait for windows of weather. They preferred hugging coasts when fresh water and shelter were plentiful. They also knew how to cross open stretches when needed. The Atlantic coast of Iberia offers a chain of anchorages, some still in use today, that would have supported gradual exploration and trade. A city placed to benefit from such routes would be wealthy in both goods and news. Traders from the north brought metals. Traders from the south brought resins and dyes. Traders from the east brought ceramics and styles. The hub would be cosmopolitan without needing to rule an empire. If the listener wonders how archaeologists and geologists choose exactly where to look on a broad shelf, the answer involves simple patterns. First come old maps and text describing ancient river mouths, bars, and bays. Next come satellite images and aerial photographs that reveal paleochannels, ghost rivers beneath sand. Then multi-beam surveys trace the bottom with sound, and magnetometers sniff for ferrous anomalies that might mark anchors or tools. Sub-bottom profilers follow, seeing layers below the surface. Each method narrows the search. When instruments point to a line that looks like a cut canal face or a geometric terrace, divers and ROVs drop in. They look for tool marks at consistent heights, for stones laid in courses for corners. If none appear, the line may be natural. If some appear, the team establishes a grid and begins the slower work of proving it. Cores extract thin cylinders of sediment that can be dated. If a core pulls up a layer of domestic debris, charcoal, seeds, shards covered by a clean layer of marine sand, that is a classic signature of a flooded settlement. Simple, steady, repeatable steps write the proof, or erase a hope, without drama. To keep the bigger picture in view, it helps to step outside the Mediterranean Atlantic frame for a moment and notice how many places on Earth tell variations of the same shoreline story. On the Sunda shelf of Southeast Asia, lower seas once connected islands and open plains that now sit underwater. In Northwest Europe, Doggerland's meadows and rivers now under the North Sea fed families and herds until rising water took them. Along the Indian coast, the shifting of deltas and the work of storms have redrawn outlines more than once within recorded memory. In each place, human beings adjusted. They built new piers, moved their villages, and kept telling stories about the old ones. The audience for the Atlantis story today lives in a world of coastal change as well. They recognize the pattern. The myth's power rests not only on a glamorous island but on the quiet recognition that any coast can move. With that perspective, the evaluation of each Atlantis candidate sharpens. The Santorini Minoan case remains a model of how a myth can be anchored to a real chain of events without insisting on an exact overlay. The overlap is strongest in culture and disaster, not in map coordinates. The Dunyana Cadiz possibility remains attractive for its geography and proximity to the strait, but it needs a strand of decisive evidence, preferably architectural, pulled up from beneath the marsh and matched to dates and a plan. Sicily, Malta stands firm as a laboratory for coastal urbanism interrupted by nature. One could spend years cataloging and interpreting evidence there without exhausting it. The Azores, though charming as an idea, hold their place on the list. Only a future surveys produce structure that looks undeniably built and undeniably old. The Black Sea, rich in submerged archaeology, continues to demonstrate how quickly a shoreline can leap inland in human time. It is a teacher more than a candidate. Now and then, a popular claim will surge on social channels. A new scan, a rectangle in the silt, a hint that a city grid lies beneath. The patient response remains the same. Does the feature survive a second, clearer survey? Does it align with cultural material on the nearest land? Are there artifacts in place not scattered by trolls or storms? Can the layer in which they sit be dated by more than one method? Can the community of researchers repeat the finding? When those answers are yes, even modest discoveries become solid steps forward. When any answer is no, the claim goes back onto the shelf. Calm method is not the enemy of curiosity. It is its anchor. At this point, the script can afford a practical aside on tides, because they influence where a city might choose to place its rings and canals. The Mediterranean's tidal range is generally small. The Atlantic's, especially along certain coasts, can be wide. A harbor built to a precise draft in a tide-rich zone must consider how ships will clear at low water. This is where inner basins, locks, and tidal gates become helpful. Ancient engineers did not use the word hydrostatics, but they observed levels and flows and built accordingly. A ringed city plan with layered basins could function as a tide-smoothing system, allowing steady movement of cargo while the ocean rose and fell outside. If such engineering existed in antiquity on the Atlantic side of Gibraltar, traces might include massive hinge stones, gate recesses, or scoured floors where moving water accelerated. If these are found one day, the argument for a sophisticated harbor leaps ahead. Navigation back then also leaned on simple but effective tools: lead lines for sounding depth, sounding poles for channels, and perhaps wooden boards for measuring speed by counting knots against water flow, a practice whose later forms survive in language. Pilots memorized bottom textures by feeling the grit on the line's tallow after a cast. Fine sand, coarse sand, mud, shell. Such habits sound small, but they add up to a civilization's confidence at sea. A city that served as a maritime school and clearinghouse for such knowledge would live in memory even if its stones went under. Trade networks weave into this picture like rigging lines. Copper from Cyprus, tin from Iberia, or Brittany or Cornwall, gold from African rivers, resins and cedar from the Levant, dyed fabrics from skilled urban centers. These moved along coasts and through straits. A port that sat at the meeting point of these streams would thrive. If the city in the story grew proud, it may have done so by naming itself the center of this web. When later listeners heard of its fall, they would have felt the loss in their own markets. As supply hiccuped, prices rose, and fashions shifted. Memory works that way. It ties a distant event to the taste of salt and the weight of a coin in the hand. It is fair, too, to imagine in gentle detail the daily life around the canals. Children might have learned to swim in the inner ring. Fishermen could have set nets in the current, timing their work to the pull. Temple bells or horns might have marked the hours, and cranes powered by human treadwheels might have lifted cargo. On market days, barges might have lined the edges like petals around a flower, each selling from a different region. Scenes like this make the story human without adding anything supernatural. They also explain why the plan, a city of circles and flowing lanes, sticks in memory. It is a design that people would tell others about because it was pretty and because it worked. When discussion returns to the mathematics of the plane, practical questions arise again. If a field grid is described as a certain number by a certain number, and if the total is given, do the units resolve into something that can be walked in a day or two? If so, the plane would fit neatly behind a coastal ridge in many regions. If not, a scribal error is likely. Simple arithmetic checks combined with known densities of ancient populations produce a range of plausible sizes for the city and its hinterland. Within that range, archaeologists select spots where rivers once braided and where a flat area large enough for such a grid existed during the relevant period. The outcome of such study is rarely a dramatic X on a map. It is a carefully prioritized list of squares to investigate. Just as the map is narrowed, the timeline is clarified. The famous 9,000 years before phrase often stretches belief because it places the event well before known urbanization. Some scholars have suggested that the number encodes months or seasons instead of solar years, which would bring the timing closer to known Bronze Age events. Others propose that the figure was symbolic, chosen for philosophical reasons to contrast a distant age with the present. A cautious synthesis accepts that the exact number may be less relevant than the placement of the story relative to known cultural peaks and disasters. If the telling gathers impressions from multiple centuries into a single narrative, that would not be unusual in oral traditions. The wind then becomes a window rather than a date, a span in which maritime cultures rose, a major eruption occurred, and coastlines changed. From here, the conversation can afford to be constructive. If asked to design a minimal set of investigations to settle the strongest candidate, what would they be? The answer is refreshingly modest. First, conduct a high-resolution multi-beam survey across the ring-like anomalies in the Dunyana-Kudus region, followed by sub-bottom profiling to see beneath the sand. Second, take a grid of sediment cores across those features, looking for sharp transitions from terrestrial occupation to marine sand, and test each layer for microfossils and pollen that pinpoint environment and season. Third, where cut faces are suspected, send a small ROV to inspect for tool marks. Fourth, sample sediments for trace metals that match known ancient alloy production. Fifth, compare dates with known regional events, earthquakes, tsunamis, cultural changes in a transparent matrix. None of these steps require exotic technology, only patience and coordination. If the results show nothing but dunes and marsh features, the candidate shrinks with grace. If the results reveal structure, the path forward becomes obvious. Elsewhere, on the Sicily-Malta platform, a similar plan would focus on gaps in today's map's zones between well-studied harbors where older channels may hide. Around Santorini and neighboring islands, work that continues to refine tsunami footprints will sharpen models of wave travel that can test narratives of sudden loss. In the Black Sea, shelf surveys will add to the rich gallery of drowned sites that teach methods and caution. On mid-Atlantic islands, a handful of sheltered coves can be map signs of quarries and artificial ramps. If none appear, energy can be conserved for stronger targets closer to the strait. Alongside fieldwork, the cultural thread continues its quiet work. The story has already taught generations to respect the sea's memory. It has encouraged people to keep an eye on the shore, to document changes, and to read old coastlines like history written in sand. Museums now present drowned cities not as warnings but as windows. Visitors see anchors that last felt air 3,000 years ago. They see coins cleaned of salt and time enough to show a figure's face. They learn that a city underwater can be a gift to science, preserving wood and rope that decay quickly on land. Such exhibits lower the temperature of debates. They make the idea of Atlantis feel less like an argument and more like a shared curiosity about the many ways human beings have lived with water. A small, grounded reflection helps here. In some modern harbors, wooden piles from Roman quays still stand, black with age, in silt a few meters below today's waves. In river deltas, entire neighborhoods from the last few centuries lie under quiet mud, their outlines visible in sonar, like shadows of recent memory. If those places deserve attention, So does any older port with similar fate. The difference between a proven drowned city and Atlantis may turn out to be nothing more than a name, a matter of whether the discovered plan and date fit an old sentence. Either way, the real reward is the map itself growing more detailed, the contours of human shoreline life emerging one survey at a time. As the script moves toward its next arc, it threads back to the opening cadence, a tale carried across centuries, because it invited verification, a bright city, a confident people, canals, gardens, a moment of change, and the sea taking back ground it once held. Whether the end came in one day or one season is not the heart of it. The heart is that coastal civilizations know the terms. They build, they measure, they prepare, and sometimes they move. The loyalty of the story lies not with a single address, but with a human habit, the habit of living at the water's edge and remembering that the edge moves. The city's imagined heartbeat slows and the script widens again. Not to drift, but to let patterns from other shores clarify what kind of traces should exist if a ringed harbor once stood where river water meets the tide. In sheltered embayments around the world, dredging sometimes pulls up fragments of everyday life, the shoulder of a jar, a carved peg, a worn gaming piece that slipped from docks and settled into silt. When these finds appear in orderly layers beneath a blanket of clean sand, the story is usually simple: a working waterfront, then a sudden change, then silence. If the change came with shaking and flooding, the sand tends to be sharp-edged in the core, a quick layer rather than a slow rain, and the tiny shells in it tend to match deeper water than the site once knew. Such signatures do not require legend to be meaningful, but when a legend points to a shelf with many such signs, attention gathers there like boats in a lee. Technology guides that attention with a gentle, methodical hand. Multi-beam sonar lays down a panoramic picture in shades of depth, regular shapes, straight lines, right angles, circular arcs that hold their radius, stand out against nature's looser textures. Sub-bottom profilers add the second story, the bodies of buried channels, the slices of old riverbanks, the tears of landslides frozen in the seafloor's memory. Autonomous underwater vehicles travel set paths, keeping altitude steady, their sensors sniffing for small anomalies a human eye might miss in the dark. Remotely operated vehicles arrive last, not with drama, but with focus, to look closely at what maps and profiles hinted was there. If they meet a face of cut stone, it will not be the shadow of an idea. It will be a surface with tool marks, edges and joints that repeat at human scales. If they meet only eroded ledges, that too is a conclusion. This is the unhurried tempo of seafloor truth. Watch out for this. The more precise the technology becomes, the more temptation grows to treat any crisp image as confirmation. That is why surveyors loop back over the same patch of bottom from different angles, at different times, and even with different devices. When a shape holds up under that pressure, it becomes interesting in a new way. Divers then set grids and bring up samples not of mystery stone, but of context, bits of charcoal, seeds, fibers, that place people on that site and give them a century, and when the pollen is right, even a season. This is how a canal face stops being an exciting line and becomes a place where someone once tied a boat and hefted a sack of grain. As the careful passes continue, the script threads back through the leading candidates to settle them in a final arrangement that is firm but not inflexible. Santorini and the Minoan world remain a powerful analog. Real maritime grandeur, wounded by real geologic force. The core alignment rests on culture and catastrophe, rather than an exact map. This is a teaching case. A civilization can be balanced on sea trade, enriched by seafaring skill, and then humbled by nature, in a time span short enough to compress into a single generation's memory. Listeners can hold that image without requiring it to be the same island as the one that the text places beyond the Mediterranean's western gate. Along the Atlantic doorway, the Dunyana Kadi zone holds its place as the most economical path forward. The setting matches many needs. A plain behind dunes, estuaries that braid and cut rings in sand, proximity to the strait that makes the phrase "beyond the pillars" feel literal, and a long record of coastal cultures that would have woven their lives into that landscape. The weakness is the usual one. Suggestive shapes are not yet tied to architectural certainty. That is not a flaw. It is an invitation for the simplest, fairest test map thoroughly, core carefully, and let the layers speak. If the rings are dune arcs, the data will say so. If human hands shaped walls and channels there, the data will say that too. Sicily and Malta shine as the workshop where ancient engineering meets geology in plain view. Here the value is less about a single name and more about building a library of what coastal construction looks like after centuries underwater. Breakwaters, carved pools, quarries with ramps. The catalog from this shelf helps interpreters elsewhere draw distinctions faster between natural and built. It also proves that complex seafront architecture is not an outlandish ask of antiquity. It exists, and it is photogenic even when half buried. Farther into the ocean, the Azores return as a quiet horizon. They satisfy a poetic longing for a grand island out in the swells, but they lack the simple logistics that make a large ancient city plausible. Nearby supply points, many trading partners within easy reach, and harbors that behave predictably in storms. The bar for evidence must be correspondingly higher. And if one day a harbor wall with cut faces and a paved ramp is found, the conversation will recalibrate. Until then, their role in this script is to remind listeners that beauty and allure are not the same as proof. The Black Sea steadies the mind one more time. It shows what a rapid rise in water level looks like when it takes villages and fields within living memory. It shows how a stratified sea can preserve wood and rope, and even the shape of a hull. It does not fit the beyond the pillars clause, but it underwrites the mechanics that any drowned city hypothesis must obey. Continuity of life, followed by a fast event, followed by a clear set of changes in the sedimentary record. It is a laboratory for understanding, and its lessons apply beyond its shores. A gentle interlude folds back to claims that have captivated many imaginations, but falter under patient light. The Richet structure, ringed and striking, is lifted by geology and carved by wind rather than people. Its rings are too large, its context inland rather than coastal, its surfaces a textbook for erosion rather than engineering. The Bimini Road demonstrates how beach rock fractures can form straight lines that mimic masonry to a hurried glance. The Cuban deepwater rumors illustrate the gap between a dramatic sonar blur and a plotted map with scaled, repeatable features. Each of these examples is useful, not because they invite scorn, but because they train the eyes. After learning from them, a viewer becomes better at telling a built corner from a broken ledge, a planned canal from a tidal creek. From discernment, the script glides to daily textures again, because large questions benefit from small details. In a ringed city designed for calm movement of boats, the water itself would be part of the street system. Seasonal maintenance crews would clear weeds from slow corners, sluice keepers would lift and lower gates to refresh inner basins, stonecutters would replace worn coping blocks where barges rubbed. At dawn, bakers would deliver food by boat, as well as by cart. At dusk, lamps would be trimmed along quays as children watched fish gather under the warm light. Scenes like these show how engineering and routine reinforce each other. They also suggest where evidence concentrates, where ropes chafed stone at regular heights, where soot stained ceilings near gatehouses, where food markets left seeds that fell between dock planks and slipped into silt. The more practical the picture becomes, the clearer the testing steps appear. For the Atlantic Plain, core transects should cross any ring-like features from center to edge, set at intervals that capture both high and low points. Radiocarbon dates from plant fragments in terrestrial layers should show consistency across the grid, then give way in a narrow band to marine sand with shells that date to the event. If the change was very fast, the transition will be sharp. If it was a slow encroachment, the transition will smear across centimeters that represent decades. Trace metal analysis should compare background levels with peaks. A spike in copper-associated elements in the same time slice as urban debris would nod toward industrial activity. Pollen should track from field plants to salt-tolerant species and marine indicators after the change. If tool marks are found, their height above former water level can be inferred from biofouling lines and compared across features to see if a coherent design height emerges. None of this requires faith. It requires good notes. Calmly, the script sketches the last passes of the scorecard that was promised earlier, not as a table, but as a story about balance. Textual fit asks whether the location is beyond Gibraltar, whether a flat plain of the stated proportions could nestle against mountains and open to the sea, and whether concentric water-land-water architecture could function there with ancient means. Geological fit tests if the shelf's history includes events, quakes, subsidence, tsunamis that could erase a port quickly enough to be told as a single catastrophe. Navigational plausibility asks whether ships of the time could reach, supply, and trade at that site with regularity. Archaeological signals count what has already been found nearby that points to dense human life. Pottery scatters quarries carved harbor faces. Technical feasibility acknowledges that some candidates are easy to survey fully with today's tools, while others would consume years for a partial map. When these quiet weights are placed on the balance, the Doñana-Cadiz corridor settles near the top for immediate testing. Sicily-Malta follows closely as a documented school of coastal building. Santorini stays high on the list of analogs for culture plus disaster. The Black Sea stands as a method teacher, and the Azores remain a long shot waiting for a decisive surprise. A final round of quick facts prepares the conclusion without hurry. Quick fact: most round cities documented to date are modest in footprint, but rich in detail. Piers, streets, foundations, because ordinary lives leave orderly traces. Quick fact: a city plan with rings would concentrate traces at repeat intervals. The pattern itself would help surveyors find the next segment. Quick fact: the ocean keeps secrets, but it also preserves, especially when silt is fine and oxygen is low. Wood that would rot on land can last like a memory in the dark. Quick fact: the difference between a legend and a lesson is often the availability of data. Once a trench holds a wall and a date, conversation shifts from if to how. The narrative slows for a moment over the human reasons this story continues to matter. A modern coastal resident understands that maps are promises made in pencil. Shorelines retreat, new channels open after storms, dunes walk. That lived knowledge gives the Atlantis story its enduring sympathy. The legend is not just about a proud city. It is about anyone who has watched a tide creep closer to a garden, anyone who has stacked sandbags, anyone who has moved a cherished shop from the waterfront to a safer street because the sea had a new idea. The philosopher's lesson about moderation has companions: adaptation, patience, and the humility to measure often and speak with care about what the measurements say. From that shared ground, the script shapes the ending it promised. A ranked verdict that is clear, but not absolute. A single next step that any listener can recognize as a fair test. And a calm farewell that widens the view beyond a single city. The verdict goes like this: the strongest present-day candidate for focused fieldwork remains the Atlantic littoral around Doñana and Cadiz. It aligns with the phrase "beyond the pillars," sits on a shelf with the right geomorphology for ring-like forms that could be either dune arcs or designed basins, and lies within a region of dense, ancient coastal life. The second tier contains the Sicily-Malta platform as a proving ground for how complex seafront engineering behaves under the weight of centuries, and as a place where additional mapping can sharpen distinctions useful elsewhere. Santorini remains a cultural and geological anchor, demonstrating the scale of events that can reshape seafaring peoples. It serves as the model rather than the map. The Azores retain their place as a horizon of possibility with a high threshold for proof. The Black Sea continues as the premier classroom for fast sea change and underwater preservation. Now the single most testable next step is set plainly on the table. Conduct a high-resolution, wall-to-wall multi-beam and sub-bottom survey over the ring-like anomalies in the Dunyana Cadiz zone, followed by a tight grid of sediment cores designed to capture a transition from terrestrial occupation to marine deposition. Publish the maps and core logs openly. If the rings prove to be natural arcs and no human stratigraphy lies beneath the marine sand, the hypothesis can be retired with respect. If, on the other hand, even one straight canal face with tool marks is found with matching dates and supporting debris and context, then an archaeological campaign can begin at once with a clear target and a clear clock. One more careful breath carries the story to its final shoreline. The chain that began with Egyptian priests, moved through Solon, and took shape under Plato's pen, has carried a delicate cargo, a picture of a city designed around water, a memory of change that felt sudden, and a reminder that coastlines are not monuments but conversations between land and sea. The legend's endurance is not a stubborn refusal to face facts. It is an invitation to gather them. It has helped generations keep an eye on the shelves where rivers hid their mouths, and where human hands once built into the tide. A museum guide might end here, but the ocean historian's voice lingers a moment longer, because there is one more gift in this story. It teaches how to look. Stand at any estuary at low tide, and the bottom writes in simple words channels, bars, pools, eelgrass, the paths boats prefer. At high tide, the same place is a plain of glitter. To watch both states and to remember both is to understand how a city could be visible on one day and gone in another. This is not a cause for fear. It is a cue for attention. Knowing that the edge moves is the first step to living wisely at the edge. The closing image is quiet on purpose. Evening settles over a harbor. A small boat glides along a modern quay, where children lean over the rail to watch fish turn. Farther out, a lighthouse blinks in its calm rhythm. Beneath the waves, somewhere not far from a river mouth, there might be a line of stones in a curve, then another line, then a straight length that joins them. It might be only geology. It might be the top course of a wall that once supported a market canopy where a mother counted coins while a child tasted salt on his lips and looked toward the channel's mouth. If divers and maps one day find that wall, the debate will quiet, not because the mystery dies, but because it changes shape, becoming the kind of mystery that science likes best. How people arranged their lives along water, what they ate, what they made, what songs they taught their children to keep time with the tides. The script completes its promise by stepping clearly across the threshold between legend and work plan. The ranked verdict is given with measured confidence. The single most testable next step is precise, and the broader lesson is placed where it belongs, in a future where many coasts, not just one, ask for thoughtful attention. The farewell is gentle. May every listener who loves sea stories carry this one not as an argument, but as a reason to care for shores, to measure honestly, and to read the subtle signs written in mud and light. A last line closes the wake behind the story with a steady cadence. The sea forgets nothing. It files everything. It keeps ruins and preserves ropes. And it returns old shapes on clear days to those who know where to look. Whether the ringed city is found as described or resolved into other names and plans, the search has already done something quietly valuable. It has taught a way of seeing, patient, curious, and kind, to evidence. And that is how any enduring voyage should end, with charts improved, with eyes trained in, with the horizon still wide.